We think of Vikings as raiders, longships cutting through fog, dragon-headed prows slicing the sea, monasteries set ablaze. That image is familiar, but it is only the first act. The true nightmare began after the battle was finished. The chronicles tell us which kings fell, which treasures were seized, how many warriors died. But when it comes to the women, the pages fall silent. Their fate is barely mentioned, their names left out. What happened to them was considered unworthy of parchment or too horrific to describe. Archaeology fills that silence. Across Ireland and England, evidence shows that women were the true prizes of conquest. Shackles made for slender wrists, ankle rings small enough for children, pits dug not for grain, but for human storage. These finds show that the capture of women was not incidental to raiding. It was central. Women represented value that outlasted treasure. Gold could be melted down, silver divided relics hidden away. A woman could work in the household, weave cloth, prepare food. More than that, she could bear children. And in Norse society, the children of enslaved mothers were enslaved as well. A single woman could generate wealth for generations. The sagas glorify the warriors who died, but the ground preserves the truth of those who lived on in captivity. Bones, chains, and soil tell the story the chronicles would not write. For the men killed in battle, suffering ended in an instant. For their wives, daughters, and sisters, the ordeal was only beginning, stretching across years, sometimes lifetimes. Modern Dublin is remembered for cobblestone streets and river light, but in the 9th and 10th centuries, it was the centre of a different kind of commerce. From 841 onward, the city grew into the largest slave market in northern Europe. Archaeology shows why the docks expanded almost every decade for more than 60 years. They were not rebuilt for fishing boats or fur traders. They were designed to handle ships arriving with human cargo. At Woodquay, excavations revealed iron shackles, ankle rings for children, and storage houses with carved drainage channels in their floors. These channels were not for stormwater, but for human waste. The buildings were long-term holding facilities for captives. Runic inscriptions found in Schleswig record the price of lives. 20 silver coins for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 for one injured in capture. These figures were not scribbled notes, but carved into stone, as permanent as any monument. The Irish annals record that in 862, 47 warriors were killed at Port Maro. They do not mention the 53 women taken away in longships. Soil tests near the site provide the missing testimony: 23 female bodies deposited in bogs, their bones marked with skull fractures, defensive wounds, and broken ribs. These were not casualties of battle. They were deliberate executions after the fighting was over. This pattern repeated again and again. The young and healthy were sold. The old, the weak, or the resistant were killed. Life and death were measured in silver. From Dublin, captives were dispersed in 2 directions. Some were absorbed into Norse households as domestic workers or forced concubines. Others were shipped east, transported through Novgorod and Kiev to the slave markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. Arabic chroniclers describe pale-skinned women offered for sale as exotic luxuries. Viking traders supplied them in steady numbers. The markets were brutal. A Frankish woman might be displayed in chains inspected like livestock. her teeth checked, her arms examined. Mothers and children were separated infants, priced as little as 2 coins. The scene repeated day after day. The chronicles are silent about this traffic. They describe relics carried off abbeys burned kings defeated. They do not speak of the women, but the docks, the waste channels, the bones in the ground make clear what the annals omit. Dublin thrived not on wool or wine, but on the commerce of human lives. Slavery was not the only fate for captured women. Many were absorbed into households under the guise of marriage. What the sagas call union was, in truth, ownership written into law. Norse society measured wealth not only in silver or land, but in dependence. Wives, concubines, children, and slaves expanded a man's lineage. Each woman taken in a raid added to his household's power. The Old Norse word kona meant more than woman. In legal codes, it meant owned woman. A wife was property, her body part of a man's estate, as surely as cattle or tools. The Icelandic Gragas law codes compiled later, but preserving older custom describe the process. When a warrior killed a man, the slain man's wife became his property. Within 3 days, he was required to declare ownership before witnesses. Her consent was irrelevant. Resistance was irrelevant. The union was binding. Children born from it were considered legitimate heirs. Archaeology and written sources show this was not occasional abuse but an institution. In England, Scandinavian settlers married Saxon widows to claim estates. In Ireland, raiders forced unions with local women to secure alliances. Violence was smoothed over with custom, but its function was clear inheritance through rape. The system left no escape. If a woman took her own life, her family was punished. Norse law treated her suicide as property destruction. Relatives owed fines of 40 silver marks, more than most free farmers could earn in a lifetime. Her death was counted not as liberation, but as loss of value. Elsewhere in Europe, parallels appear. Frankish codes fined abductors, but the payment went to a guardian, not the woman herself. Byzantine records speak of war brides taken by force. Yet, in Norse society, what stands out is codification. Forced marriage was not crime, but right spelled out in law. The sagas disguise this reality. They speak of heroes wooing maidens, of kings claiming brides. Archaeology and law strip away that illusion. Behind the stories were screams, forced vows, and children conceived in bondage. For the warrior seizing another man's wife brought legitimacy. Children bound her lineage to his own. Her body became a means of property. Transfer her womb an economic tool. For the woman, slavery and marriage were 2 forms of the same loss. In both, autonomy was erased. Chronicles rarely describe her voice, but the silence of the sources should not be mistaken for absence. Captured wives lived in prisons of ritual and law as binding as chains. Even the church adapted. Missionaries sometimes recognized these forced unions as valid, baptizing the children born of them. In doing so, they sanctified conquest. Rape became lineage legitimized under the cross. Forced marriage in Norse society was not hidden. It was legal, public, and celebrated. The law did not simply tolerate violence against women, it organized it. Not all women captured in raids lived to be sold or bound in households. Some were killed as part of ritual sacrifice. For the Norse, death was an exchange, and women enslaved and voiceless were often the offering. The clearest account comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat, who witnessed a Viking funeral in 921. A chieftain's body was placed in a boat with weapons and horses. A slave girl was chosen to die with him. She was given intoxicating herbs, paraded into tents, raped by companions, then strangled and stabbed. Her body was laid beside the corpse and burned on the pyre. For centuries, some doubted his report. Archaeology has since confirmed it. Female skeletons in Scandinavian boat graves show ligature marks on the neck-broken bones from restraint, and traces of narcotic plants in their teeth. The rituals were not rare. They were repeated customs. At Bangor in 878, annals record the destruction of a monastery but say nothing of women. Excavations show otherwise. Fragments of female bone arranged deliberately with animal remains burn layers consistent with ritual pyres. These were not chaotic killings. They were offerings. The logic was clear. A warrior did not go to the grave alone. Horses, weapons, and sometimes women were sent with him. Sacrifice was payment to the gods and continuity for the community. Women became currency in this spiritual economy. Later sagas turned this into poetry. They wrote of Valkyrie who chose the slain. But archaeology reveals the truth. The women in the graves did not ride to Valhalla. They were forced down, silenced by others' hands. Some skeletons show prolonged suffering. Strangulation marks combined with burn damage suggest that some victims were alive when fires were lit. Soil samples show decomposed bodies bound in place. Drugs dulled their senses, but not their fear. The violence was not hidden. It was part of Norse ritual life. Graves across Sweden, Denmark and Norway confirm the pattern women sacrificed in funerals, their bodies placed to accompany the dead. At Oseberg, 2 women were buried in a ship. One older, surrounded by rich goods. The other younger showed signs of violence. Scholars suggest she was sacrificed to serve the elder in death. Power and subjugation Houghton carried into the afterlife. Sacrificial killings of dependents were known in other cultures, from Scythian horse burials to early Chinese dynasties. What marks the Norse is the brutality confirmed by both law and archaeology. Sacrifice was not private. It was public, codified, and witnessed. Ibn Fadlan wrote that the chosen girl was taken from tent to tent before her death. Her body was used as part of the ritual. The act was not only killing, but demonstration of domination. The sagas are silent. They tell of warriors and gods, not of sacrificed women. To admit their existence would stain the heroism celebrated in verse. Yet the bones remain their arrangement and trauma. Telling the story, the texts omit. For enslaved women, survival was uncertain. Some were sold, some forced into marriage. Others were killed to accompany a dead man into the next world. The question was never whether they would serve, but whether they would serve in life or in death. The nightmare did not end with the women themselves. It extended to their children, or more precisely, to the question of whether those children were permitted to live at all. For the Vikings, reproduction was not simply biology. It was economics, law, and strategy. Norse law was unambiguous. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. At first glance, this might suggest continuity of wealth, each new birth adding to the master's household. But, in practice, the logic was harsher. Infants unable to labor or survive the rigors of early life were not seen as assets. They were mouths to feed, without return, and so many were killed. Archaeology lays bare this grim truth. Excavations at Thetford, a base once used by the Great Heathen Army, revealed tiny skeletons discarded in rubbish pits. Their bones carried unmistakable trauma skulls, crushed by blunt instruments, ribs broken in symmetrical patterns, damage inflicted by deliberate strikes. These were not deaths by disease or neglect. They were acts of decision executions carried out against the smallest and weakest. At Repton, where one of the largest Viking camps once stood, the evidence is the same. Among 249 skeletons, uncovered only 63 were women. Infant bones scattered in midden heaps rather than laid in graves bore signs of violence. They were not buried with care, but discarded with refuse. These children lived days, weeks at most, before being extinguished. Their brief lives ended not with funerary rites, but with silence. The chronicles, as so often say, nothing. Monks wrote of battles, relics, stolen abbeys in flames. They counted warriors slain, named kings brought low. But infants are almost entirely absent from the texts. Their erasure in writing mirrors their erasure in life. Archaeology restores them, demanding recognition where ink refused. This was not a uniquely Norse horror. Rome had long practiced expositio, abandoning unwanted infants on hillsides, leaving them to die or to be picked up as slaves. In medieval Europe, unwanted babies were sometimes left at the doors of convents. But in Norse-controlled settlements, the killings appear more systematic, bound to the arithmetic of slavery. Romans abandoned, Vikings executed, medieval Christians occasionally rescued. Norse pits reveal no reprieve. Even the church, which condemned infanticide in doctrine, found ways to profit from the cycle. In territories touched by Norse rule, baptismal rolls show sudden spikes in foundlings. Many of these were the children of enslaved women baptized for a fee, then quietly sold. A child's brief life became two transactions, first to the priest, then to a trader. Later, under Norman authority, the Domesday Book reveals continuity. Children of servile mothers rarely appear in population counts. They were excluded, not because they did not exist, but because they had no recognized value. A life without economic worth had no place in the record. What began in Viking camps endured in Norman bureaucracy. For enslaved women, motherhood was a snare. Pregnancy might bring hope, but also fear. A healthy infant could be torn away and sold. A weak one might be killed at her side. Her body became a site of exploitation, her child a calculation in someone else's ledger. Genetic evidence underscores the story. Mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child shows strong continuity of Celtic and Saxon female lines in Scandinavian populations. Yet, paternal lines often vanish, replaced by Norse ancestry. This imbalance suggests survival of the mother's women forced into reproduction while many of their children perished. The legacy is still etched into DNA endurance of the women, absence of countless children. Anthropologists argue that the killings served as population control. By eliminating unproductive infants, households conserved resources for laborers or women of childbearing age. It was not random cruelty, but systemic management of enslaved populations. Brutality shaped into policy. The horror lies not only in the act, but in its normalization. In a Norse household, killing an infant might have carried no more weight than slaughtering a lamb too weak to survive the winter. In law, the child was property. In economy, a liability. In society, expendable. Yet the bones themselves contradict indifference. Some show defensive trauma on tiny arms, as if infants instinctively raised them to shield blows. Others reveal multiple fractures not from accident, but from repeated violence. These details expose suffering, not quiet abandonment. For every enslaved woman, fear extended beyond her own survival. It enveloped her children. To bear life meant risking lost separation or the trauma of watching that life extinguished. Her womb became a site of both renewal and terror. Chronicles remain mute. Sagas romanticize warriors. But the earth does not forget. Beneath Viking encampments and Norman estates, infant bones form a silent testimony to a system where human life was reduced to profit and waste. The nightmare of conquest extended not only to the wives of the defeated, but to the children who never grew old enough to be remembered. For enslaved women who survived raids, markets, and forced unions, another shadow remained punishment. Terror was not incidental. It was calculated, designed to bend bodies and minds to submission. Domination was reinforced through spectacle, and the slave's body became the surface upon which power was carved. The most chilling evidence comes from Dublin. In 914, Irish forces retook the city after decades of Norse control. Outside the walls, they discovered pits, stone-lined holes 6 feet deep and 3 feet across. Too small to stretch out, too shallow to stand upright. They were cages sunk into the earth. Excavations centuries later confirmed their purpose. Within these pits lay skeletons of women. The bones bore fractures consistent with deliberate injury legs, broken at the shin arms, snapped at the elbow ribs, cracked inward. These were not wounds of battle. They were inflicted methodically after capture. The aim was not to kill quickly, but to disable escape, or even suicide. The pits were instruments of prolonged death. Women thrown into them might survive days, even weeks. Soil analysis reveals decomposition layers consistent with slow decline, bodies wasting away in place. Some pits contained stagnant water rising and falling, with tides drowning victims inch by inch. Others were filled with jagged stones, ensuring constant pain. Norse law codes explain the rationale. A female slave who attacked her master or attempted to flee could be sentenced to burial alive. But burial here was never swift. The pits allowed air, prolonging suffering. Punishment became theatre, a living execution visible to others. This was not unique to the Norse. Byzantine rulers blinded rebels, parading them as warnings. Anglo-Saxon law stripped criminals of protection, casting them out to die. But the Norse cultivated a slower cruelty. They turned confinement into spectacle, suffering into a performance of authority. Archaeology uncovers the details. Scratches along pit walls suggest desperate attempts to climb. Fingernails torn from hands. Bones showing partial healing prove some women lived long enough for fractures to knit before final death. In one pit, a skeleton was found crouched, arms crossed in a posture of defense. In another, teeth marks in bone hint at starvation victims gnawing themselves in despair. The pits were not hidden. Many lay near execution grounds or city walls. Their placement ensured visibility. Captives were often forced to watch companions lowered inside. The groans of the dying, the stench of decay became constant reminders of the price of defiance. Fear radiated outward from the pits, disciplining whole populations through terror. The audience was as important as the victim. By punishing one woman in this way, masters reminded dozens of others of their fate should they resist. The pits transformed bodies into warnings. Terror became communal memory. chronicles once again are silent. They record battles, retaken cities, burned rebellions suppressed. But they do not describe the slow wasting of women in the earth. They omit the spectacle, perhaps because it was too ordinary, too familiar. Archaeology fills the silence with bone, soil, and stone. The psychological weight of the pits cannot be overstated. For enslaved women, the threat was constant. Their bodies were never their own. Every gesture, every glance was weighed against the possibility of punishment. Submission was survival. Resistance meant agony. Symbolically, the pits carried further meaning. To bury alive was to erase a person not only physically, but spiritually. Norse cosmology emphasized proper funerals mounds, pyres, ship burials. Denying these rites was annihilation. The woman was not merely killed. She was erased from memory, denied the honor of remembrance. Yet the earth remembers what lore and saga did not. The pits still hold their victims' bones curled in eternal crouch scratches, etched into stone. Silent testimonies of defiance, despair, and slow death. For enslaved women, courage was not celebrated in sagas. Courage meant risking the pits where days stretched into nights of hunger, thirst, and pain. Viking culture glorified fearless warriors, but punished fearless women with earth and silence. The pits of terror remind us that domination was not only through axes, markets, or forced vows. It was enforced through fear, carved into the flesh of the living, preserved in the soil of the dead. By the middle of the 10th century, Viking warfare no longer looked like the unpredictable raids of earlier generations. What had begun as sudden bursts of plunder had matured into an organized system. Conquest became logistics. Raids became supply chains. And at the heart of this system were women seized, transported, sold, and in some cases forced into reproduction. Archaeology shows how deliberate this economy became. Shipwrecks raised from the North Sea reveal designs specialized for carrying people, not cargo. Some were fitted with reinforced decks, others with ventilation shafts carved into bulkheads and water stores sufficient for weeks of travel. These were not merchant vessels hastily converted. They were slave ships built for the express purpose of transporting dozens of captives. The largest recovered so far had capacity for at least 80 chained individuals below deck. Runic inscriptions provide even more chilling details. Manifests carved in stone along the Baltic list. Human cargo alongside furs, amber, and iron. The figures are precise. 20 women per ship, a standard load. Byzantine treaties with the Rus Norse traders who controlled the rivers of Eastern Europe confirm the categories. Young women commanded the highest value. Pregnant women were discounted. Children under 10 were nearly worthless, treated as baggage. This network tied Viking economies into wider global markets. From Dublin, captives were shipped east into the routes of Novgorod and Kiev, and from there to Constantinople and Baghdad. Arabic chroniclers describe Viking caravans arriving with pale-skinned girls from the northern forests presented as exotic luxuries. In Baghdad's markets, such captives fetched premium prices. Demand in the Islamic world drove supply in the Norse one, and the trade grew with ruthless efficiency. Closer to home, excavations in York, the Viking city of Jorvik, reveal a still darker dimension. In 1979, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a building dated to around 876. Beneath its floors were 64 small stone cells, each equipped with iron rings bolted into the walls. Soil analysis revealed occupation layers stretching across 4 decades. The bones found inside told a consistent story. Women repeatedly pregnant their skeletons, showing the strain of multiple childbirths. When they could no longer bear children, they were discarded. This was no ordinary prison. It was a breeding facility. For nearly half a century, it operated in the center of York, reducing women's bodies to reproductive stock. Captives were confined, forced to produce children, and then discarded when their usefulness ended. Church records confirm the collusion of religious institutions. Baptismal rolls from York list over 700 births tied to the facility. Only 12 of those children survived beyond the age of 5. The rest vanished. They were labeled foundlings of unknown parentage, a euphemism for children born of enslaved mothers and quietly eliminated. Account books from York Minster show regular payments to the operators of the building. These were not bribes, they were contractual fees. The church was not merely aware of the practice, it was financially invested in it. Viking armies also adapted their campaigns to slavery. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of portable pens designed for long marches. Wooden frameworks reinforced with iron fittings could be assembled and disassembled quickly. Iron rings built into the planks show patterns of wear evidence that chains had been attached and detached many times. Some pens were small, designed for children. Others, large enough to hold a dozen adults. These cages marched with the armies, ensuring that captives were secured and processed even while the campaigns continued. To imagine Viking warfare without slavery is to misunderstand its purpose. Battles provided the harvest of human beings. Infrastructure ships, pens, warehouses, markets ensured the harvest could be stored, transported, and sold. Human bodies were not incidental victims of war. They were its intended prize. The organization of this trade mirrors other imperial systems. Rome had networks of auction blocks. The Ottomans later constructed the Devshirme pipelines. The Vikings, often remembered as chaotic marauders, were in fact administrators of a human economy. Their sagas glorify raids. Their stones and bones reveal commerce. The receipts are everywhere. Dublin's dock posts show 60 years of steady expansion, each phase timed to growth in the slave trade. Runestones record slave prices with the same permanence as land grants. York's breeding pens operated openly, their profits recorded in church accounts. Even graves confirm the pattern isotope studies of female remains in England trace their origins to Ireland and Scotland, proof of forced migration. The image of the Viking raider fades before this evidence. They were traffickers, merchants of suffering logisticians of flesh. The sagas speak of honor, glory, and Valhalla. But the ground beneath Dublin, York, and Kiev speaks of markets, pens, and chains. In this industry of slavery, women were not peripheral. They were central. They were traded across seas, confined in breeding facilities, marched in cages, and sold in markets stretching from Ireland to Baghdad. Their lives, their children, their very bodies became the raw material of a global economy. The chronicles praise kings and victories. But the soil remembers something else, that the Viking Age was not only an age of conquest, it was an age of commerce in human beings. By the mid-10th century, Viking expansion faltered. The great heathen armies that once swept through England fractured. Civil wars in Norway and Denmark sapped power. Rivals, Christian and pagan, pressed in. But the decline of military reach did not end the system of enslavement. Violence did not vanish. It turned inward. The most haunting evidence comes from Repton in Derbyshire winter camp of the Great Heathen Army. Excavations uncovered a mass grave, 236 female skeletons. Isotope analysis showed they were not foreigners. They were local to Norse settlements. They ate the same diet, drank the same water, shared the same origins as the men who ruled. They were daughters, wives, sisters of conquerors. The bones told of execution. Many were strangled, some bludgeoned, others poisoned with mercury compounds that left traces in teeth and bone. Poisoning induced delirium madness and finally death. Soil cores showed layers of decomposition. Not one event, but episodes. Bodies added over days, even weeks. This was not panic. It was method. Among the remains lay mothers and infants buried together. Paired deaths ensured no survivors. Archaeologists found one skull, a girl, perhaps 14 years old, carved with runes after death. Betra Svar. Better this way. Why? The logic was brutal and familiar. Viking men knew exactly what awaited captured women. They had inflicted that fate on others for generations. Enslavement, rape, sacrifice, and sale. Facing defeat, they turned the same methods on their own. Death was judged safer than capture. There are echoes elsewhere. At Masada, Jewish rebels killed families before Romans breached the walls. In medieval Japan, Junshi suicide avoided dishonor. But the Norse case stands apart. These men acted not from imagination of cruelty, but from experience. They had authored the script themselves. They now followed it with their own kin. Chronicles remain silent. The sagas omit the episode. To record such acts would fracture the heroic image. Yet, the ground at Repton preserves it. Layers of soil mercury, traces bones of women and children, all testify to a society so accustomed to violence that it consumed itself. The grave was not sealed once. It was reopened repeatedly. Core analysis shows burials stretched across decades. Not a single desperate massacre, but a recurring pattern. A policy of erasure. The implications are staggering. These were not nameless captives. They were Norse-born. Women who wove cloth-baked bread raised children. They were erased by the same hands that claimed to defend them. A system built on domination normalized over centuries collapsed inward. The runic inscription, "Better this way," lingers as epitaph. It captures the collapse of a worldview where control outweighed kinship. Fathers killed daughters. Husbands executed wives. Families erased themselves to avoid the mirror of their own cruelty. At Repton, the saga of conquest ends in silence. Warriors who once sang of Valhalla left no words for this. The soil alone bears witness. In its twilight, the Viking Age turned its violence upon itself. The Viking Age formally ended in chronicles with the deaths of kings. In 954, Eric Bloodaxe fell at Stein. In 1066, Harold Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge. Weeks later, William the Conqueror defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings. To the chroniclers, these moments marked twilight, but archaeology and memory reveal otherwise. The system of violence persisted. The Normans, Northmen by name, inherited it. They brought to England the same structures of domination cloaked in feudal law and church ritual. Saxon women were seized and married to Norman knights. Contracts written by clerks framed it as civilizing unions. In reality, it echoed the codified forced marriages of Norse law. Convents swelled. Church records show sudden growth in nunneries after Hastings. For many women, the cloister was the only refuge. Others refused and chose death. Chronicles note spikes in female suicide reframed as martyrdom in hagiographies. The church canonized them. The state listed them as losses of property. Archaeology confirms the pattern. Excavations at Norman castles reveal chambers designed for women alone, small windowless cells with iron-barred doors. Refuse pits nearby contained infant bones. Mortality approached 100% in some contexts. These were not accidents. They were deliberate strategies. Children of forced unions carried inconvenient claims. Neglect or elimination resolved the problem. The Domesday Book makes it explicit. Compiled in 1086, it lists women alongside livestock and tools. Female dependents appear as assets, replaceable units in estate tallies. The Norse system of ownership slipped seamlessly into Norman administration. Genetics sharpens the picture. Studies of mitochondrial DNA passed from mothers show that around 60% of Icelandic female ancestry traces back to Celtic women. These were captives carried from Ireland and Scotland. In Norway, nearly 40% of female lines come from the British Isles. The evidence is biological, not anecdotal. Descendants of the enslaved live on. The pattern is asymmetric. Male lineages remain predominantly Scandinavian. Female lines bear Celtic and Saxon markers. The imbalance speaks clearly. Norse men remained. Norse women were fewer, and foreign women were absorbed not voluntarily, but through repeated forced unions. The infrastructure of this system endures in the ground. In York soil, analysis confirmed the operation of a breeding facility for decades, profits tied to church coffers. In Dublin, dock timbers charted 60 years of steady expansion, each post a marker of increased human traffic. At Repton, soil layers revealed half a century of mass female killings. The traces do not describe accidents. They describe policy. Chronicles omit. Sagas praise kings, gods, and warriors. But bones whisper another saga. Women reduced to property. Infants discarded in heaps. Pits that swallowed the defiant alive. This was not incidental. It was the structure itself. The legacy outlived the longships. It shaped Norman conquest, feudal records, church accounts, and the DNA of Europe. It reshaped families. It erased lineages. Its scars remain 1,000 years later. The silences persist. Chroniclers passed over it. Sagas ignored it. Even Christian rulers, who absorbed the system, cloaked it in new words rather than abolish it. The record survives in archaeology, in forensic science, in fragments of bone. One fragment is most haunting. A skull from Repton belonging to a girl barely in her teens. Into the bone, someone carved words after death. Better this way. 3 runes cut as justification. Not the voice of the victim, the voice of the executioner. That fragment is the true epitaph of the Viking Age. Not sagas of heroes and gods, but silence broken only by bone.